for coming. This is the Intersections panel. It's part of a recurring series that's co-sponsored by the Critical Identity Studies program, as well as the Office of Spiritual Life. Some other programs as well.
Right, Cecil's office.
Yeah. Exactly, right? The Office of International and Intercultural Affairs. I'm Jennifer Esperanza. I teach in the Department of Anthropology, and today we have with us several panelists. We'll start here with Daksha Howard, who is the coordinator at the Office of International and Intercultural Affairs.
Actually, it's just Office of Intercultural Affairs.
Oh, or Intercultural Affairs, sorry.
But I used to be in the International Office, maybe that's part
Yeah, maybe that's what's part of it. So, Intercultural Affairs. We've got Roxanna Sanchez-Avila, who is a junior and is majoring in both studio art and women's and gender studies. And then last here on the end is Milica Mihajlovic, who is a Russian and German major, is a sophomore. What I wanted to do today is sort of like leave each of the panelists here first to tell their story. You know, this discussion tonight is largely about immigration and about their different experiences in various respects, in terms of arrival, in terms of generations removed from the direct immigrant experience. And I wanted to actually start with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Junot Diaz, who is an American writer, a novelist, who won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2008. He's an immigrant from the Dominican Republic and moved to the U.S. when he was a young child. So he self-identifies as a 1.5 generation immigrant. And in a recent interview, he said, we have a lot of myths about immigration. We assume that immigration is a deficiency that can be overcome. We assume that there's some strange advance that one makes when one sheds this inadequacy to attain some sort of national purity. And the panel tonight is intended to challenge those various myths that he's alluding to about immigration and the myths of what immigration means. We'll start with these three panelists to share their stories, but the forum is meant for all of us to engage in a conversation, to ask questions and to share insights, and offer new ways to thinking about the immigrant experience and to honor those narratives. The country has a long history of being built and is still being built by the contributions of immigrants. But we're really living in contentious times where policies and practices and discourses against immigration and against immigrants themselves have been very hostile, one of the more hostile in recent memory. I don't know if you've been following the news regarding immigration reform, but lately Obama has come under fire. Some also naming President Obama as deporter-in-chief, largely because within his own presidency, the number of deportations has reached nearly 2 million. It's the largest number of deportation of immigrants, undocumented or in kind of limbo status within his administration alone. Nearly 2 million, right? And so it's important to think about what's going on during these times. So we'll start, I think, with each of our panelists to tell their story in the relationship to the immigrant experience, and then we'll proceed with questions. So we'll start with Dr.
Well, my name is Daksha Howard, and as Jen just said, I'm the coordinator at the Office of Intercultural Affairs. I was born in Uganda, East Africa, and what's really interesting about my family is that my parents were born in Africa as well. So I'm 100% of Indian descent, but my roots are 100% African. So that's very different for people to understand that. My grandparents were the ones that came from India into Africa. That was all part of the British, the Great British Empire, and so what's really interesting about Indian people is that you'll see us all over the world because of the British influence in India. So we left Uganda when I was almost about 9 years old, and we emigrated. I don't even like to use the word emigrated, because we ended up in the UK as refugees. So this was in 1972, and some of you may know this and may have heard of Idi Amin, who was a crazy dictator and kind of woke up one day and had basically said that, you know, he was going to give us Ugandan Asians, and that's what we're known as, Asians. When you're in the European continent, we are Asians, and I know that Americans are not used to that. When they think of Indians, or when they think of Asians, they think of something else. But anyway, so he woke up and decided that we no longer could live there, and that we had 90 days, we had to leave the country. Basically that's how, you know, I remember my family was one of the last families actually to leave the village, and I was almost 9 years old, so I remember quite a bit, and it was very traumatic. It was very, very traumatic. So I was born in Uganda. I was there till I was 9, and then grew up pretty much in the UK, and came to the United States in 1988. There's a lot more to it, but I'm going to let them.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I consider myself a Honduran-American second-generation immigrant. I guess it's not really my story, it's more of my mom's story. She migrated to the United States in 1985 with my father, and my father had been to the United States before, a few years before. He went back to Honduras, which is in Central America. And my mom, she's the oldest of 8 children, so she was pretty much raising her siblings. And she didn't have the best mom around. So my mom knew my father, and they're a few years apart. My father is way older than her. So she took the chance, and she's an ambitious woman still to this day, and she decided to come to the United States with him. And her story is it's a bit different than from what other people, I guess, because my father was he was a drug addict, and she was in an abusive relationship, so it was a domestic violence. So my mom pretty much stood by his side until all 3, I have 2 older sisters, until all 3 of us kind of grew up. And to this day, she works in an ice cream truck. So it's been about 28 years, and she's been there pretty much as my sister's father and mother. And I mean, with that, it's kind of interesting because she was in her early 20s, and I mean, as I said, I'm second generation, and sometimes I feel like I have an identity crisis, just because as a second generation, I've never been to Honduras, but I feel like I don't have a lot of cultural background. But then at the same time, I feel like I'm not American, because what does it mean to be American? You know, we always hear that American means this melting pot, but you know, what does that mean itself? You know, we're all very different. So yeah, there's that, and you know, trying to figure out, I guess, who you are. I guess me, especially as a second generation, I feel like sometimes my sister have that same thing, but theirs is a bit different. But yeah, it's been pretty much 3 women, 3 women that raised me, because I am the youngest.
I'm Milica, and as Jennifer said, I'm a sophomore. I was born in Serbia, and I immigrated to the United States in 1998 when I was 4 years old. So it's been about 16 years almost. So I consider myself generation 1.5. First, we kind of immigrated in two groups. My dad and my oldest brother, who is 13 years older than me, they immigrated in 1997 so that my oldest brother could play tennis he was on the track to be a pro, and now he teaches tennis and still his whole life. So they came in 1997, about a year before we did, and then a year later, me, my other brother, who was 7 years older than me, and my mom also, we all decided, let's go visit them. It's been a year, we haven't seen the rest of our family. So we go over there, we get tourist visas so we can enter the United States, and we go over there, and this is when things really started to heat up in Yugoslavia with all the fighting and the bombing, and Belgrade was bombed soon after we left. So we're just like, oh, okay, never mind, we're not going back. Not yet. So, yeah, and kind of like Roxy, I have this sort of identity crisis. Like, anyone who knows me really well, like, one of the first things I will tell you is I am Serbian. Like, that is, I've convinced some people on this campus unintentionally that I'm an international student, like, because that's the first thing I mention and that's the first thing I stress. But that's how I feel when I'm here, when I'm in an environment surrounded by people who are not Serbian. Otherwise, when I'm with, let's say, like my family or with other Serbians, I just feel like I don't fit in, like I'm too American, just because I don't have that sort of background. When I go back to Serbia, I stay with family mostly. I'm staying with my cousins, my grandparents, and the majority of my family is over there, which is nice, but my brothers can go back and go see their friends and have fun and go out, whereas I just kind of don't have that. I feel like I'm missing that link almost,
Thanks. And I guess I'll start by just following up, and each of you can answer in however way you'd like, is maybe first talk about, and sorry, just kind of go out of order for the questions I posed, but a lot of you said things that resonated with one of the questions here that I presented to you, which was, how does your experience affect the way you think about place? How you think about how you even define home, right? So I can start with anyway. Sense of place.
Sure. I guess for me, sense of home is like wherever my family is. Just because, like, even though sometimes like I'm here and I'm like, oh, I miss home so much, but I guess it's always where like I'm able to easily have the access to go home. Like, being here, like, you have to take a 2-hour bus ride, and you have to get a 4-hour plane ride, and like, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I can't call Beloit home, because yes, even though I have relationships with a lot of people, it's still not that the same feeling of having, like, I guess for me it's also the idea of like easy transportation. Like, many people are from Chicago or from Milwaukee. You could easily drive there, you could get a bus, but I mean, I feel like coming from LA, a big city where you could easily take a train and be in downtown LA, like, you can't do that here. Like, you need to have a car, you need to have a friend with a car, you need to have a bike or something. And sometimes even public transportation like stops running like probably around this time, and like you can't really explore the city. But I guess, yeah, the family and transportation, or easy access to that.
Yeah. To follow up, because you had said you've never been to Honduras, right?
Yeah.
And for myself, I didn't even introduce sort of my story, but I'm second generation Filipino American. So my parents immigrated from the Philippines. I was born and raised in the United States. I didn't go into the Philippines until I was 23. So yeah, it was strange. So I don't know if, was there talk about Honduras as like home, but not really for you, or?
Not really, just because my mom has always been focused on working, and like she never takes a day off. Like, we tell her, oh, let's go to the beach. No, I have to go to work. I don't like going to the beach. And it's like, okay. So I mean, she's never really talked to us about home beside like her home. She never talks about it that way. She kind of talks about it like, I was a nurse, I was helping raise my siblings, and your grandma, she's a bad woman, but I still love her. And I mean, and my father, he never really spoke about Honduras. Like, I just know, like, he hardly ever spoke about himself. Like, he mostly would talk about, like, all I know is that he was a soldier during the Civil War that happened in Central America during like the 70s. Then I know that he was a police officer, and then that he had 2 other daughters with a Salvadorian woman. And I mean, it's always been a very distant and chaotic place, and especially now, like, you know, with a lot of like the gang violence that's happening out there. And I mean, my mom, she isn't a citizen, but she is under this thing called temporary protective status, and that was given during the 80s to many Central Americans because of the violence that was happening. And my mom was able to get it when she was here. She applied for it like in the early 2000s. And I mean, just recently my sister was telling me that they're actually going to be removing that program from Central Americans. So people will no longer be able to apply to this. So it's like, you know, people are being left with whatever conflict is happening in Central America. And I mean, I don't know if you guys been up with the news about Mexico. Like, there's a lot of gang violence there too, with the narcotraficantes, and I mean, it's just pretty interesting. Like, but yeah, it's never been a place that's really been talked about in a positive way.
Okay. Yeah. Daksha, please.
So I'm just gonna go back a little bit,
Oh, yeah,
so
sure.
I can tie this point in. So when we left Uganda, and I was saying that I was 9 years old, was my mother, myself, my sister and 2 brothers. And we were separated actually from my father and my eldest brother because they were Ugandan citizens. And my mother had a British passport, so we were actually what you call British subjects. So, and our names were on her passports. So the irony of this whole thing is that, you know, she was going back and forth to the British embassy in Entebbe, and even though we were British subjects, it was quite a nightmare to just get visas to actually go to the UK. And my father could not get a visa, neither could my brother, because they were Ugandan citizens, so nobody would accept them. So we were in this dilemma that, okay, what's going to happen? So my dad said, look, you just get out of here with the kids, because that's the safest thing to do. We'll figure out something. What ended up happening was my dad went to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross basically told him indirectly that if you didn't have a Ugandan passport, then you could possibly get in to any European nation that will accept you. So my dad and my brother destroyed their passports and then went to the United Nations. And the United Nations, so by this point, we had left. And so I mean, you can imagine we're young, have no idea what's happened to our father or our brother. And my mom didn't speak hardly any English. We're going to the United Kingdom as refugees. We're going to be in this refugee camp. And there's no male figure. In Indian culture, that's a very important thing, you know, to have a male figure around. So there's no male figure. And my mom's a very strong woman. She always did all of that stuff. But so it wasn't about until almost a year later or so that we found, I was in bed, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and this man in this gray silver suit was standing right by my bedside and just poking me and saying, wake up, honey, wake up. Daddy's here. And I just thought, no, this is just a dream or something. This is weird. And I looked up, and it really was him. And I just remembered holding onto his neck and not letting go because I could not believe it. Well, apparently that process had been going on for almost a year. My mom had been working with the local authorities in London to track my dad down. And then my dad had been in Switzerland and then in Vienna. So that's where they were found. And the interesting thing was when my dad finally got the visa to come and be with us in the United Kingdom, they had asked my brother as well, what do you want to do, you know, because they had been given an option if they wanted to go to the Netherlands. And my brother said, well, no, Dad, I'm going to go to the Netherlands just in case we get kicked out of England, so then you guys have somewhere else to come to. So that sense of, you know, everything being snatched right from under your feet, you know. But I just remember that night very vividly, that, you know, it was just like a mixture of emotions that all, for time I was getting used to the fact that, oh, maybe my dad was dead, and then all of a sudden, you know, so it was very, very interesting. And then also, you know, living in a refugee camp for almost a year was, I think back to it, and the British call them resettlement camps, and they were not resettlement camps. And so there's a lot of emotions and stuff with that. And so as I moved around from the United Kingdom, from Africa to the UK, and then when I moved to the United States in 1988, I moved not because anybody told me to. I did it because I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And but I still don't feel like I belong, if that makes sense. I feel, it's funny, I feel like my roots are more in England than anywhere else. You know. So, yeah, it's just been sort of a very interesting story.
Yeah. Milica?
Well, I have a sort of kind of detachment, so when it comes to the term home. So like, if I'm with you and we're gonna go back to your house, I'm like, okay, let's go home. Like, your home is my home right now. So I kind of have a detachment in that sense, because when we moved to the United States, we first came to the Chicagoland area, and because that's where Chicagoland has the biggest population of Serbian people, so we're gonna go where our people are, you know. We didn't speak any English, it was just easiest for us to have someone there. And you know, when you see people like, you know, you don't meet many Serbian people in the United States, so when you do, you're like, oh, look at you, it's us. And you kind of like help each other out, and that happens even today. But so when we first moved, we moved to the Chicagoland area. We moved around in a couple of suburbs within the first year. By the time I was 5, we ended up moving to Indiana, which is where we stayed for 8 years. And then in 2007, after my dad passed away, we moved back to the Chicagoland area because that's where my oldest brother was, so we went to live with him. So, in the last, how long have I been in the Chicagoland area? Since 2007, I moved into my brother's house, into a separate apartment in another suburb, back to my brother's house, back to another apartment, back to my brother's house. My brother's neighbor had a fire that affected my brother's house, so we moved into a temporary home, back to my brother's house, now into an apartment that's where I am now, where my mom and my other brother are. So it's just been a lot of physical moving, not so much, it's all within like a 20-mile radius, all right in that same area. But I think moving so much has affected me in that wherever I am, I kind of call it home. So like I'm in Beloit, okay, let's go home, let's go back to my room. I could be anywhere, and wherever I'm staying at that moment, I think I would call home. But ultimately, yeah, I would probably place that term with my family. Wherever my family is, like, we all still to this day live in the Chicagoland area, like within 20 minutes of each other max. The farthest we ever lived was when my immediate family lived in Indiana, and we had some relatives in like Illinois. That's probably the farthest we've ever been from each other, but I think it's because we're such a small unit. It's my immediate family, my 2 brothers, my mom and I, and then my mom's sister, a couple of second cousins and their parents, and that's about all the family we have here. So we all just kind of stay as a close unit, so that's what I would call home. Because we're all really close together anyway, like physically, I would probably call my family my home.
I think what is very common with all of these narratives is this idea that with this experience of immigration, that even immediate families are spread out in different households, and you don't, that's kind of the new norm, right? That you may have a brother in the Netherlands, or that brother in the Netherlands was there because that was the backup plan, right? And that's kind of an interesting idea, this sort of backup plan, because I feel like, you know, with a lot of their stories, especially when there's political turmoil from countries where you've come from and you're spread out, the norm has largely been about having the family spread out and moving from one household to another, whether it's beyond your control or not. So I want to open it up to questions, comments from the audience to also have you engage. Any questions?
So 1.5, that's the generation if you were born in the country and then,
You come to the States, usually it's school age, and your formative years happens in the host country.
and then what does first generation mean?
So that's largely immigrants, so first generation, immigrants who come as adults, right, like 18 and over. 1.5 are usually immigrants who come as minors, right? So they are the children of the first generation who arrived. And then the second generation are usually those who are the children of the adult immigrants who were born and raised in the host countries, like in this case, the United States. And, you know, it is difficult to kind of know, because, you know, what if you came at 16? You know, are you first generation or are you 1.5? Because you're still a minor, but at the same time, you're also coming into your formative years, so in some ways you're also kind of an adult too. So there's some flexibility in this term.
I've been using it wrong.
Oh!
Because I always thought I myself was first generation since I was the first American in my family.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what happens often is because the way they formulated these identity categories was because some of the, you know, the adults.
And this guy's waiting there at the airport with a big sign with my name on it, and my flight had been delayed 6 hours. Then I had to go through the immigration process of, fingerprints and the whole medical thing and everything. So it took longer. By the time I came out, it was almost like 10 o'clock. And, he said, I'm going to take you to your hotel. And I thought, thank God, I just need to lay down and go to sleep. And then he said, so when we got to the hotel, he said, oh, and I'll pick you up at 8 o'clock in the morning to take you to work. And I thought, okay. And right away in my mind, I thought, well, you better not say anything because you're in a new country, this is a job, and you've just got to go. So, and I remember that first day at work, it was very interesting because the staff were asking me, so are you living with your family? And I'm like, no. Are you living with uncles and aunts? I said, no, I'm living in a hotel right now in Miami. So hold on, do you know anybody? I said, no. You don't know anybody. You just came here, and they were sort of shocked. But for me, it was a little bit easier because I already sort of had to leave somewhere before.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That reminds me of my father's story. He came in 1970 with $100 in his pocket, didn't know anybody. He landed in San Francisco International Airport, was sitting in baggage claim at the turnstile waiting for his bags to come, and ran into an old high school classmate who had just dropped somebody off at the airport. And they said, well, where are you staying? And he's like, well, I was just going to find a hotel. And, they basically took him to room with him for the first month until he, found his first job, washing dishes. But, that's the kind of uncertainty
Yes.
is the norm. Is that something that, you've experienced, either of you? Like, kind of uncertainty of where you're going to be, where people are going to live, where, is that?
I think no, because we came having my dad and my brother here. And I feel like it's always been where it's just kind of like my immediate family here and maybe some other relatives, but we've always had someone, so if like something goes wrong, we have someone there that's there for us. I think maybe my brother and my dad kind of experienced that a little bit, but my brother was coming specifically to play tennis, so we had some sort of connection here. If not family, then he had some sort of purpose and he came with me there, so they weren't alone.
Yeah, and there's a community too.
Yeah.
I guess for my parents it was, or for my mom, well, because my father had already came to the United States before because his previous partner wanted to, because my half-sisters were born in Honduras, but his partner had came to the United States and she wanted her children with her, so he didn't trust the immigration process or the migration process, so he came with them, and then he got introduced to the drugs because in the 80s that's when cocaine was being a big thing, and then he went back, so he had made connections here. And I remember my mom telling me we had I remember arriving and we had a place to go, and you know, your dad used to help this guy in a catering truck. He used to drive, and then I used to help our host, who was a woman, take care of the children, clean dishes or whatever. And then after that, like, my father raised enough funds, and then he bought an ice cream truck, and then they kind of started their business from there. But I mean, I guess early on, like with my older sister, I think there was some uncertainty of like where they would live. But then by like the late, like probably when I was like 5, like my father not bought a home because it's still owned by the bank, but I mean like there was a place where we could go back.
Yeah. Questions from the Oh, yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering if there was any way you feel that, I don't know if any of you like speak languages other than English, or I was just wondering how you think that maybe any other languages you speak would be connected to your identity, or how you feel that it's influenced your experience.
I can offer a quick story, and then I'll let. So I grew up speaking Tagalog, which is the main dialect of the Philippines. I didn't speak English till I started kindergarten, even though I was born and raised in the United States. And I'd always associated that language with family and often disciplining. So like if my parents, I was misbehaving in public, my parents would cuss me out in their language, right? So as not to embarrass. And the first time when I was 23, I went to the Philippines. I landed, airport, left, you know, the plane. And it was such a weird experience hearing, you know, Tagalog, the language of disciplining, like in the airport, or like a cashier would, you know, because I'd always associated it with family members. So it was very odd to hear, you know, doctors or, you know, somebody at the supermarket or, you know, the radio, using this language that I only associated with home and our neighborhood, which was largely Filipino, like to now a whole country, if that makes sense. It's just as if like slang was the official language of, you know, somewhere you just traveled. And it was really disconcerting for me to find like formality in a language that was so informal my whole life. I don't know if any of you haven't had experiences or.
I guess for me personally, I too grew up with Spanish in the household, and but I guess mine is a little different because I am the youngest daughter, and my older sister, she went to school and she was learning English, but she was trying, because she was the first child, she struggled a lot in school just because my mom couldn't really help her only with the mathematics part because there's no language barrier there. But then I remember my older sister telling me, she's like, yeah, I would read the stuff, try to translate it in Spanish for mom to understand. Then she would try to help me, then I would translate that into English, and then I would try to figure that out. And I mean, she tells me to this day, she's like, yeah, sometimes I do struggle with English. It doesn't click in my mind to sound out a word. Like, compared to me, I could sound out a word and say, okay, it might sound like this. But for her, it's different. And my second oldest sister, my oldest sister was teaching her how to write and read before she was even in school. And then lastly, I learned Spanish, but then as soon as I went to kindergarten, that just kind of went out the window. Like, I just learned English. And I mean, sometimes I do get like a little sad because my mom, like, she wanted to learn English, so she would tell us, speak to me in English so I could learn too. So then I couldn't really speak in Spanish because she wanted me to speak to her in English. So then I lost that, and I mean, sometimes I try hard. I try more now because I feel like that is part of my identity. That is part of me being Hondureña and like being able to speak and communicate. And this is a side note, but when I was a freshman, we went to go speak to, it was another panel, and it was a bunch of college students talking to the Latino community here. And I remember one lady came to me afterwards, and she said, I'm so happy that you said you were Honduran American, because I myself am Honduran, and I've never heard anyone else be here and say that they're Honduran, because most of the population here is Mexican or Mexican American. So, I mean, and she tells me, I'm so proud of you because you're here. And I was like, this lady has no connection to me, but she's telling me that she is proud of me because she has a connection of a country with, where my roots come from.
I speak Gujarati and understand Hindi and that. But when we first came to the UK, I was able to speak Swahili as well. Because, living in Africa, we communicated in Swahili and then whatever was our mother tongue, as we called it. But just like you, my mom didn't speak much English, and I'm the youngest in our family. And so I became this translator for everything, but the other thing was that we were told as children, you cannot speak Swahili, and we were discouraged to speak Swahili because we had come in as refugees. And there was a certain amount of resentment, right, from the British people, that why were these, now we've got all these Indian people in our country, and so for some reason, if we spoke in Swahili, it meant that we gave ourselves away, which was ridiculous because, you just had to look at us to know that we were Indian, right? It was, but, so as a result, there are words that pop into my mind in Swahili, right? But I can't form sentences, and it's really frustrating because we just had to give up a language because our parents told us, no, in order for you to excel in school, you've got to keep speaking in English all the time, But thank God, that around the home, we at least spoke in our language in Indian all the time. So that allows me to keep that identity, that, okay, that's part of my heritage and I don't have to. And what's really ironic now is that when you go to the UK, there are English people, British people, like last year I was in London in the summer, and I went shopping with my mom just to a local farmer's market. And there were white English people talking in Gujarati, and I was just like, really? What is going on here? And so my mom said, isn't this amazing? We didn't speak English, so they adapted to us. This is wild. But that's what London is like. We talk about the US being a melting pot, but honestly, you go to London, and I'm telling you, there's no bigger melting pot than London. And all the different languages that you hear, and because I was traveling on the tube train with my daughter, and I could see, because she's born and raised in Wisconsin, and I could just see the look on her face. She didn't know what was like. There were women that got on the train with hijabs. There was Eastern European languages being spoken. There was all these, and she just sort of looked at me and I said, are you okay? And she said, I've never heard anything like this. I said, you're going to hear so many different things about it. This is what it's like. But after a couple of weeks, it felt normal to her, and she said, I wish we lived somewhere like that. So, because you did feel different then. You know what I'm saying? Like here, I could feel like I could stand out because I'm not Caucasian, and I'm not from this area. So the language is the one thing that with my family that sort of gives me that time. Language?
Definitely. I think my biggest identity, the biggest cause of my identity crisis, I think, is because I'm losing the language, and that's what I associate with because I don't have any sort of memory or any sort of, I do have a background. So when I was telling my brother, I was like, oh, I'm doing this immigrant panel on immigration or on the immigrant American identity. He's like, but you're not an immigrant. I was like, wait a minute. Are you serious right now? I was just insulted. I was angry, and I was like, how dare you belittle one of the biggest aspects of my identity. But I realized, it is such a problem for me because I'm losing the language, especially being here and speaking English all the time, and I try and call my mom as often as possible because she doesn't speak. 16 years later, not a word of English. She just refuses at this point. And she doesn't have to. She has that community of people that can take her, and when I'm home, I'm the token translator. We go everywhere together. I think language for me has always been same thing that's been said. It's been separated. Serbian in the home, and then English for everything else. But English is really the language of success. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that my mom doesn't speak English and the fact that she cannot do anything on her own. Like, she will still call me to go to the grocery store with her because, like, she knows what to do. She just doesn't, she's afraid to speak or something, so that's always kind of been a hindrance. And so English has always been the language of success and outside the home, but Serbian is family. Like, I go to Serbia and I love it because everyone speaks Serbian. I'm like, this is great. There's some other Serbian kids on campus, and even though I am a little bit embarrassed of my language skills, like everyone else, when everyone's like, oh, speak Serbian, I was like, okay, and I sound great to everyone else, but even though I'm a little embarrassed of how poorly I think I speak it, I still try to with like the other people on campus that can understand me, and with my mom, and now I'm trying to do more with my brothers because, I mean, we've been here a while, we're both, all three of us are kind of very integrated into like the American culture. I've been going to school here my whole life. Both of my brothers have steady jobs. They both work as like, tennis instructors and constantly interact with people in English, so it's just easier for us to interact in English. And that's something that I'm trying to like kind of bring back so I don't lose that. I never want to lose it, and I'm constantly afraid that I'm always losing it and that I'll lose it forever one day.
One of the interesting developments in language preservation has been the emergence of classes or sometimes camps for heritage language speakers. So if any of you are interested, I mean, here at Beloit, I think we had the first section that Oswaldo had of Spanish class for heritage language speakers. So if you've grown up hearing Spanish and you can speak it, but you think it's more like Spanglish, then there are actually like curriculums now that are for heritage language speakers in Spanish, in Mandarin Chinese, in Tagalog, Vietnamese. They're all over the country. I know that Madison is home to Southeast Asian heritage language classes, so they exist if you're interested. Anna, you had a question?
Yeah, I have two questions, and you can choose which one you want to answer. But the first one is about kind of leaving behind your family, or I know that like you pretty much travel with your immediate family, you kind of split up and then you reunited. So maybe what was the experience like of like leaving behind your home or your friends or grandparents maybe, and like kind of having the feeling that you might not come back? Like, what was that like? And the second question is, I'm interested in kind of like the confusing and awkward moments. I get this a lot, like people mistake me for an American, and it's just, sometimes they're funny moments, sometimes they're a bit sad, but do you have any like, from your experience, do you have any memories or any like, experience with people mistaking you for someone else, and you either like being hurt or just maybe an amusing moment? So just pick a question that you can answer.
For me, I get confused with being Hispanic all the time. When I lived in Miami, in fact, going to the grocery stores would become a really frustrating experience because they just assumed I was either Cuban or Puerto Rican. And they would just start talking to me in Spanish, and I'm trying to pay. And there are places in Miami that when you go, they don't speak anything but Spanish in some stores. So that was a really difficult exchange, trying to explain something that I wanted or needed. And they were confused with that. Why did I look the way I look, but I didn't speak Spanish, But it happens to me here in Beloit all the time, because even in the school district, my children's school district, when I go to parent-teacher conferences or something, there's a lot of Hispanic parents that are there. And I don't take offense to this, because I think for them it's a sense of security, because they hear me communicating in English with the teachers and everybody else. So they start talking to me in Spanish in hopes that somehow I'll be able to bridge that gap. And I feel bad almost. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. I'm Indian. And then all of a sudden, they look at me and say, oh, I'm so sorry. So I get mistaken for being Mexican in the Midwest all the time.
I guess for me, I guess I get mixed a lot with being Mexican as well. Just because too in LA it's close to the border, like Southern California, and I mean, there's those moments, but then there are also the moments where I am kind of like in a way rejected by other Central Americans, because from what I know, that El Salvador and Honduras kind of share a similar accent. So I don't have that accent. I don't have like the Honduran accent. So when someone hears me speak, like I remember I went to work with my mom. She was putting gas in the ice cream truck. And this, I guess he was Salvadorian. He's all like, oh, can I buy ice cream in Spanish? And I was like, yeah, I'll help you or whatever. And then my mom came around, and then she spoke to him in Spanish, and she kind of lost her accent just because she's been here for already a long time. But yeah, he goes, oh, your daughter sounds like she doesn't have an accent. Like, she's your American daughter. And I was like, who are you to say that, you know, only because I don't have an accent? But I mean, I think that's another thing, like people kind of say, you're just an American kid. Like they never associate me with, you know, being like having roots from Central America.
Yeah, I get mistaken for American all the time. I mean, I don't blame anyone. I look American, I sound American, I am American now. I got my citizenship last year. So, funny thing about the accent, I was in Serbia this summer, and obviously when I'm speaking Serbian, I'm going to have an American accent. My English is a lot better than my Serbian. It's very much influenced. This one old family friend tells me, or she tells my aunt who was with me in Serbia for a little bit this summer, she's like, oh, she has a Leskovac accent. I was like, and that's like, we're in Belgrade, and Leskovac is a little further south. It's more like a village, and you know, I have family there or whatever, so I guess maybe some of the things I would say are not like Belgrade speak or whatever. And she's like, oh, she has like a Leskovac accent, like a country accent. I was like, that's what you picked up on? You didn't pick up on the American accent? You think I have a country accent? Like, are you serious? So I think that was probably the funniest one and the most recent one. But in terms of like, I don't know, I think I must just look generic American. I don't know. I get mistaken all the time for other people. They're like, oh, are you Harry's daughter? I was like, no, my dad's name is Micha. I don't think so. That's not, I don't know. So I blend in pretty easily. I get mistaken for other people pretty easily.
I do have a very thick British accent, believe it or not. I actually really do. I don't know what it is. After living in England for so many years, I mean, the minute, like last summer when we were there, as soon as the plane landed, I mean, it was just like this switch turned on. And I remember going through customs and that, and this guy looking at my passport and saying, you on holiday? And I said, yes, I'm on holiday here. My daughter just looked at me, she said, Mom! And I said, what? And she said, you're talking British. And I said, Bella, this is how it's going to be for the next 5 weeks, be prepared. And she just was, and I mean, literally, I mean, my cousins were there, family were there, and it's not that I was trying, it just happens. It literally, like, you know, she does. When I came back in Zing, they said, Daksha, you're talking British. And for a while, it was kind of, but it just happens. It just switches on like that.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
But what's interesting here is this is where also I think we can think about or make it more complex by thinking about the intersections of other identities, particularly I'm thinking of race, right? Where, you know, in my case, right, you know, born and raised in the United States, and having what I consider a California accent, and you know, when people say, well, where's that accent from, or how long have you been working on your accent? And I'm like, what do you mean working on my accent, right? Because it's not possible, right, in this country for me to have this accent as an American citizen. There's always this perception that if I have this, I'm either white or I have worked really hard to hide my real accent, when this is kind of what I had. I mean, probably when I was 5 and I was just learning English, yeah, but it, you know, disappeared by 6 or 7 years old. So it is interesting to think about what are people's expectations of what is American, right? Like, you know, if it has to do with accent, I think it also, on top of that too, at least in this country, is race. And England is different too, right? Because they also have very different ways of approaching race as well. but I feel that, yeah, I still get questioned a lot about when did I arrive in this country?
I actually
When I was
have
born.
a very interesting story about something that had happened to me in Walmart. I don't know, a couple of years ago, I was in the checkout line and I was getting ready to pay for something, and this lady behind me, for whatever reason, just started to talk to me, and I think she thought I was Hispanic. And then, so she sort of tried to figure out where I was from. I told her, no, I'm actually from England, and but I was born in Africa. I thought, oh, this is not good. You should have not done this.
You just opened up a can.
That's right. So, and it was going well until, you know, I started to pay for my stuff, and then she said, you know, you speak really good English. And right there, I mean, I was so offended, and I thought, and I didn't know, because I think when I told her that I was from England, but then I said I was originally from Africa, I don't know if something switched in her mind that I should have like either an African accent or whatever, but then I said to her, but I went to school in England. It just came out, and when she said, you speak really good English, I said, well, I went to school in England. It's kind of like, duh. You know? And then she said, oh, I just love the British accent. And then I thought, but I'm not speaking the British accent. So it was just kidding. And you know, I tell you, that was just such an interesting thing. When I left Walmart, I thought, wow, that was just so bizarre.
Yeah, in like the way that race sometimes precedes white citizenship, so people have this preconceived idea of how you should.
Exactly.
I confused the hell out of my kindergarten class when little like 5-year-old me comes in with a heavy Russian accent. Like, who? No idea.
You know, family as it seems like so central to all of your experiences in a way that my family has had a very different sort of role in my identity. So one thing I'm curious about is especially as 1.5 or generation or second generation, you know, what's been your experience around negotiating between family identity and then also forging an identity, you know, on your own, and maybe in ways like that that the first generation folks couldn't or chose not to, you know. That's got to be really complicated. I'm just curious to hear about how that process is going, sort of navigating family identity and then also sort of stretching boundaries in some ways that maybe make you, the parent generation, uncomfortable or angry or fearful or excited for. I mean, I'm just wondering like what that whole mix has been like for you.
I know I'm a completely like separate person in my life here and kind of my academic life, my American life versus the role I play within a family setting. So, you know, I'm in college, I'm a first generation college student. My brothers kind of went, kind of didn't. So I'm the first one to go to like a full 4-year college and, you know, be doing what I'm doing and have more long-term goals and things like that. And so that's just, my family knows that, and they know that about me, and they'll always tell, like, you know, when they meet other people, they're like, oh yeah, my daughter's so smart, she goes to college, all these things. But the type of person I am here and the personality that I have around my friends and other people I know is completely, totally separate from who I am when I'm with my family and the type of person I am and how I act around them. And that could be, I know Simeon's have a lot of different expectations for women, and I'm also the youngest, and I'm the youngest, and I have 2 older brothers, so I'm just kind of expected to do everything, and it's just, because I'm the only daughter, I have a closer relationship with my mom, and so I'm the one that's supposed to be there for my mom. My mom needs anything translated, my mom needs anything done, it's like, who's she gonna go to first? Me, and so I'm a lot more, I wanna say independent when I'm outside of the family, versus within the family. It's, yeah, that's a really complex question that I don't know if I'm doing justice to in my answer.
I guess for me, it's kind of interesting. my mom, like I said, she's the oldest, so she kind of raised her siblings. So in a way, she went to school. She pretty much, like my grandmother didn't go to school, like she mostly worked. So my mom pretty much put herself through school while taking care of her siblings, and then also helping my grandmother with her business of selling food or clothes or whatever. So when she came to the United States, she had 3 daughters, and she pretty much taught us that to be independent within the family, but always remember that family came first. But I mean, my older sister, like my 2 older sisters have their bachelor's degree. One of my sisters is going to grad school. She's going to be the first one going to grad school. And then there's me, like I'm already about to finish college. And my mom's interesting because she doesn't want to go back to school to learn English. She knows some basics of English, but we want to push her to learn English, and she has a pushback. She says, I don't have time for that. I have to go to work. And she always uses that as an excuse. And we're like, Mom, you can no longer sell in the ice cream truck. There's too much competition. There's, more gang members coming into the community that you're selling. And she doesn't see it. She doesn't see the bigger picture. And she taught us to be very independent, to stand up for ourselves, and to fight for what we believe is right. And we want her to go to school, but she's like, you guys are hard-headed. You guys think that, you could tell me what to do, but you can't. And then we're like, Mom, we're not telling you what to do. We want you to be able to have a secure job, because tomorrow you're not going to be, you might not even sell $50 in the ice cream truck. You might not even sell anything. And I mean, that's very interesting, because there's that aspect of being independent within the family, but also outside the family. But then also we're too connected sometimes. Like when I go back home, like when I went back home this spring break, my sister, let's go out. And it's like, I just want to like sleep in, and like we kind of do everything together sometimes, which is really scary. But I mean, there's like, it's very weird too, because I am the last child, and I did leave. I'm in Wisconsin right now. Like what's that all about? Like I did what my mom did. Like I had to leave my family in order to have a better future. But I don't know, sometimes my mom doesn't see it. She doesn't see that she too needs to have her education and get a GED, because sadly that's what you need in the United States today. You need to have a GED in order to have a secured paycheck.
I'm the youngest in my family, but oldest at this table. And it was really interesting because, growing up in England, Indian culture is it's very it's got a lot of rules, especially if you're a female. And I struggled a lot in school, in the sense I didn't know where, because I felt that I almost needed to escape from what I was born into, so I could fit into this other world, and so I could be accepted by all of my classmates and that. But then at the same time, when I would go home, I needed to be right back to what the expectations were of me as an Indian girl. And it got so challenging as a teen. Finally, I just came to this conclusion, this is ridiculous. You're going to have to take best of both, and that's how you're going to have to sort of map your life out if you want to be happy. And my sisters have all had arranged marriages. I mean, they got married young, 16 and that, and so once I had made that decision, and like in my teens, that I was going to do this, it just sort of gave me this ownership of my own identity. And I didn't get married till I was 30, and I didn't marry an Indian man either. And that was a bit of a shock for the family. Well, for my mom, because there was this that she expected me to be sort of married within not just the Indian culture, but in the caste system, because, you know, we have caste systems and we're Brahmins and we're the highest, and so if you even marry outside of your own caste, that's like, whoa, but some of my family members put it, to marry a white guy, whoa, what are you thinking, you know? But I think that very early on I knew that if I wanted to be happy, I knew what was good in my own culture, and I knew what was good from the Western, and that's how I was going to have to live my life, and that's what I chose. And funnily enough, my mom, my husband is her favorite son-in-law. Because she tells me, he's not so demanding like those Indian son-in-laws. It's just, you know, so it just sort of changes as years go on.
I think it's similar in my experience. So I had a very traditional Filipino family, and youngest. I think we're all youngest then, right? And you know, I don't know if this is true about youngest, but I think there's a certain level of freedom you can have to explore your identity and to kind of do things that are not traditional. You know, compared to like, you know, my brother who has a computer science degree, my sister who's a nurse, right? Like, wow, great. We know what that is. And when I told my parents, anthropology, linguistic, what is that, right? You know, and even though I went further in school, you know, to the PhD level, they still to this day don't know what it is that I do. They think I went as far as a master's, because like master actually, for like, it means you've mastered something. Like the doctorate, you know, doesn't mean anything. I mean, and I was largely raised, so even though, you know, I have my parents, they're still alive, you know, they actually left me in the care of my grandmother. So when I was born, my parents always held 2 jobs. So when they were done with their 9 to 5, there was always like an evening shift, a graveyard shift, or a weekend shift. They always had like a second job. So I was largely raised by my grandmother, who never had any formal education. So she couldn't read or write. So to imagine like having this granddaughter who loved to read books, right, wanted to go to the library all the time, you know, and she couldn't read, she couldn't sign her name, right? Her name was like an X, basically. And we worked so hard on trying to get her to learn English, and she never did. Yeah, there's a certain distance that you have with family if you go to this other path. You know, I wasn't a computer scientist, I wasn't into biology. I liked watching European movies. I liked, you know, reading British novels, and that was so foreign to my parents. You know, in high school, I had won a scholarship to go to Germany, and they didn't know what that was going to be. Like, why do you want to go away from us, right? And that was really hard. Like, the idea of kind of becoming somebody interested in the liberal arts, right? Somebody who wasn't taking that very orthodox path of the immigrant way of life was really foreign, is still very foreign to my family. So when I go home with them, you know, we watch Wheel of Fortune, we talk about the weather. That's kind of as far as it goes, and I've always felt a kind of, I don't know, like jealousy of kids who can go to their parents and talk about, you know, I'm working on this chapter of my dissertation, or, you know, I'm working on this grant to do, like, my parents wouldn't know what that means. And so there is that kind of distance that I've had to accept, which is sad, you know, but yeah, it's kind of a reality that I've had to accept. Any other questions from the audience?
I guess kind of adding to what you just said about like your parents not knowing what, like, you know, what it means to have a PhD. Like my mom is the same thing. Like she believed that as soon as you got your bachelor's degree, like we got our bachelor's degree, that meant that we would be able to help her economically. And sadly that doesn't happen to like people like us, because you got loans that you gotta pay off, especially if you go to in-state schools, it's way more expensive. And I mean, like my mom to this day, like she, like my sister, my second oldest sister, who's the one who's gonna be going to grad school, she tells me, yeah, mom comes in here and she just doesn't get it yet. She thinks, you know, I just kind of waste my time because she's a English, rhetoric, and similar like WGST double major from college. So my mom didn't understand that because my older sister majored in biochemistry with a double minor in mathematics and psychology. And then there was me. I was doing photography. And I mean, she's I always remember my sister telling me, she's like, yeah, mom doesn't see my mom didn't see potential in me until I came to college. She would always tell my sister, why is she wasting her money on that film? She could be using that money to help me, pay for the bills or something. And I mean, she honestly didn't see potential. She's like photography, this. And I mean, and then, until I came to college, she says, oh wow, these are very beautiful pictures or whatever. And then I was like, yeah, mom, it's not just, being a photographer, taking a photo of a plant, I want to do something with it. I want to use that as a vehicle for something else. I think stories like these and my family's, I think those are important to hear. And through photography, I think that becomes a powerful tool. And I mean, my older sister, sadly, she hasn't been able to go to med school, but I mean, she has gained the responsibility as a mother as well, like my mother did. She raised us, and I mean, she wanted to be a coroner, open dead bodies, and the opposite of what my mom did, because she was a nurse. But my mom was so happy. She's like, yes, you're gonna be going to medical school and stuff like that. And then there was me and my middle sister and me, and then she's like, what are you guys doing? What are you doing for life? And it's like, all right, I guess. Not doing anything.
One thing that I did do last summer when I was in England that I felt that was really, really important was I wanted to show my daughter the refugee camp. And I have been going back to England, back and forth for many years. And for some reason I just was not ready, but last year I was ready. And I think it was probably because my 13-year-old was with me, and I really felt that it was important for her to see the first point of my home in the United Kingdom when I first arrived, from Africa, and what it was like. Because she's heard me talk, she asks me questions, and I remember telling her that, when we arrived, I mean, you come from a hot climate, and we arrived in the United Kingdom, and it's freezing. I mean, it is so cold. My toes were freezing, and I was feeling these tingling sensations, but I didn't know what it was, because I was little, and I remember crying and saying to my mom, please, Mom, I promise I'm going to be good. Let's just go back. This cannot be right. This is where you go when you die. Really, because it was cold and didn't feel right. And then when we were taken to the Air Force base, where we were all placed, we were in these cubicles with cots, and there was no heating, and there were these old aerodrome buildings, the old from the World Wars, the green ones and that. And so that image and that vision and everything had stayed with me. And so she heard this. But so last summer, we went to Hemswell, where the camp was. Well, we got there, and it looked familiar, but looked very different. And my husband said, are you sure this is it? I said, I know that building there, but the rest of it doesn't look familiar. Well, what has happened was the whole area has been converted into the largest antiques area in Europe, right? But what happened was we had entered in from the back end of the base. So I'm trying to explain to her, and there's this sense of sadness that's sort of welling up inside of me, because I'm like, I wanted to show it to her exactly the way I saw it, And I know that it's not possible, but there was a big part of me hoping that it would be the way it was, so she would believe my story, if that makes sense. And so, I was looking around, and this guy came out, and he looked just like a British major, you know, and he asked me a question, and I said, you know, I thought this was Henswell Air Force Base Camp, and he said, it is. I said, but it doesn't look as familiar as I thought it would, because I remember we were in Hannah Block, and then there was C Block, and he said, you've got the right place. He said, I'm the historian for this place. Couldn't believe it. So he said, you're in the back end of it. So he took us to the front end, and then that was it. It just looked completely familiar. And there I was standing with my daughter, able.
It's very powerful.
I wanted to, one of the questions also I sort of asked you too is to think about moments. This is often the experience with immigrants, whatever generation, but do you remember moments or experiences in your life where somehow you were either told or somehow you had the feeling that your experience was not normal or not typical? Your life was not normal or typical. Because, you know, the irony of it is that the immigrant experience is the norm of this country, but yet somehow our discourse is always about normalizing a very particular way of life, a very particular set of identities. So, yeah, growing up, do you ever remember like times when you just were told or made to feel like, no, this is not?
There's a very specific memory I have. So I don't remember a lot from my childhood, not in Serbia, not so much when I grew up and I started living in the United States, but there was this one moment. And, you know, I realized I was in a different place. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know the language for a long time. But when I was in kindergarten, so I'm telling you, little 5-year-old me with a heavy accent, no one wanted to talk to me, no one wanted to be my friend, no one could say my name. Like, it was just all a little depressing at first. But I come home and I tell my mom, like, I'm crying. No one wants to be my friend, no one's talking to me, like, even the teachers don't know how to approach me because I don't know English. And my mom's like, don't worry, you're just as good as all the other kids. And I'm like, I didn't think I was worse than them, what? I thought they were the ones with the problem, you know? And so it had never occurred to me to be like, I'm the one with the problem, it's my life that's messed up somehow that I need to change it. So I think that was probably the big one for me, and that stuck with me, I'll tell you. 14 years later, I can still remember that.
And it's coming from home, right? Not,
Yeah. Not so much, I mean, I knew, like, yeah, logically I was like, I don't know anyone, who are all these people, no one knows me, but like, I was never made to feel, like it had never occurred to me as a 5-year-old that like, that I was different from other children, I was so different that like, it would make a difference. I'm like, we're all kids, you know, like, all kids are the same, you can't have that many differences, but it just made me feel this sort of kind of inequality or like disability or something, like something was wrong, some sort of deficiency.
almost like a secondary status, something.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, also school age, one of the things that struck me is that my experience wasn't typical was little assignments that the teachers would give for homework that I don't think people realize. Some of these assignments called for materials that would not be part of an immigrant family's life. So I remember growing up in California, we had to make a seismograph, you know, the things that measure earthquakes. So one of the materials we had to use was an oatmeal canister, like Quaker Oats, like they come in these. And like, my family's like, what's oatmeal? and things like Elmer's glue, right? And so I remember like my parents, you know, the shame I also would feel when my parents said, well, we don't have Elmer's glue, but we have rice, and they would like make it into a paste, right? Like mixing rice with water, and I had to use that as glue, and there was this huge sense of shame, like, we don't even have Elmer's glue. I mean, that was a big thing for me. Like, you're 5 years old, like, your world is falling apart. So you don't have Elmer's glue, and you don't know what, you know, oatmeal is. But, you know, that's kind of the interesting thing here is like these normalizing processes in school systems or in just what we might think are just very harmless kinds of activities when there's a lot of assumptions about what a household should have. Like, it's very easy to come by. So I remember my parents buying oatmeal because they needed, and they would just dump the canister in my mother like for months trying to figure out what to do with this oatmeal. She was like, this cost us like $5. I don't know what to do with oatmeal. What do you use it for? And so I think we ended up like tossing it once it started getting weevils in it. But I mean, yeah, it was just that kind of experience.
Oh, I was just gonna say like things like that in grade school and whatnot, and also just like poverty. Like I remember when I was younger in school, when I didn't have things like that, I hate my mom because I was like, all the other kids have it and I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my grade school, they wore uniforms, and my mom was like, oh well, you're not gonna go to school in a uniform because I don't have the money to get it for you yet. And I was always the only one without one, so then I'd always be mad at my mom because I didn't understand really why I couldn't.
Right. And we don't have the language or the understanding that there is some like structural limitations of the adults who are taking care of us. You kind of assume like, well, you're the adult, you're supposed to be able to have all this stuff. And you're too young to understand that like they have limitations as well, so you end up blaming them and it causes a lot of tension that is unnecessary or is misdirecting. Yeah?
So did you guys have any tension towards your parents when you were younger?
Or had?
Personally, I don't think so. I mean, I think I had more tension with students. I think especially when I got to middle school, because when I was in elementary, both of my older sisters and I went to the same elementary. My older sister went to a different middle school because then we had to move, and then me and my middle sister went to the same middle school. And during this time, my father was still in the United States, and I would help him over the weekends because he would give me, he would pay me for helping him. I had a job. And I remember this kid who was from middle school, like when I went to middle school, no one knew that I had parents that worked in an ice cream truck. No one. Everyone in elementary did because they saw little Roxy going into the ice cream truck as my mom was selling, and then I would help my mom too, be like, oh, what do you guys want? And then in middle school, this kid saw me, and I was like, oh, crud, like no, like this is not supposed to happen. And then he started making fun of me, and this was in 6th grade, so I was beginning my teen angst too early. So yeah, he started making fun of me, and then he told this other boy who like didn't even know like what this other kid was talking about, so he started making fun of me too. He's like, oh, I hear you work in an ice cream truck, and your parents work in an ice cream truck. So I was about to beat him up because I was a little aggressive. And I mean, and I mean, yeah, and like my 6th grade teacher, who was also a 2nd generation immigrant, he saw me and he told me, he said, you shouldn't listen to kids like that. Like, you should be proud of where your parents come from because they clearly have raised you and the way you are, and you shouldn't let that bother you. And I mean, I remember like I was so aggravated. I was like, why are these kids making fun of me? Like, who are they to say like, oh, your parents work in an ice cream truck? Like, if I'm not saying that other jobs were less or more than what my parents did, but I mean at the same time, I don't know if their parents had jobs like hardworking jobs as well. And I mean, I never picked on people. Oh, your father's a gardener, like, ha. Like, I mean, and I think that's something that some kids don't understand, like they don't cherish. They don't, I'm not saying take pride in it, but they like kind of belittle their parents. And I mean, I've learned to say, yeah, my mom works in an ice cream truck. Like, it sucks, but I mean, she's there working and she's making money, sadly, that way. But I mean, it's better than her, I guess not having a job.
For me, actually, it was very difficult to go shopping with my mom because I lived in the north of England in a very small fishing village, very much white, and it was quite racist. So I felt like I always needed to do what I needed to do to protect myself. And so my mom always wore traditional, Indian clothes. She was always in a sari. And I remember there were times when I just would have to go with her, whether it was grocery shopping or doctors or whatever. And I would either walk way ahead or I would be, like way behind, because I did not want anybody to know that that was my mother. And looking back on it, I mean, I think it's horrible. But when you're a child, all you're trying to do is just get through another day. And you're trying to fit in, and you're trying to get accepted, because some of you have heard this story, but one of the things that shaped my thinking that way was my very first day at school. And I remember going into the classroom. There was a round table, and we were all sitting there, and the teacher had asked one of the girls to take care of me and said, Carol, you'll be in charge of taking care of Daksha, showing her around and everything. And at that point, I spoke English, but growing up in Africa, the British English was sort of a little bit different, and racism, we didn't understand. I didn't even know that there was really a difference or whatever. And I just remember a boy at the table saying on the very first day, and saying, "Oh, great, another N-word." And I did not take offense to it, because I didn't know what the N-word meant. But because he prefaced it with the word great, I thought, can only be good, right? And so that was what was in my mind. And then, years later on, as time went on, I found out that this is not actually a nice thing. And then just even things like walking down the road, and kids would shout across the road, "Paki!" And I'm like, I'm not even Pakistani. What are you talking about? Just things like that. And so when you're a child, when you're a kid, you try to sort of protect yourself. And so I would find myself distancing from my own culture and family members if they were dressed traditionally, or even if they ate Indian food or something like that. I mean, I remember I used to be a vegetarian. I started to eat meat because it was like, okay, I've got to fit in somehow. And it was a real mixed emotions of how, to fit in these two worlds. It was very, very, very challenging.
Yeah, it was not so much directed at my dad, more so at my mom. She was home more, and my dad used to just he was a truck driver, so he'd be gone for days and weeks and things. But it was kind of like a process. I would be first mad at my mom because, why don't you understand? Just why are you not understanding? She didn't understand the concept of a sleepover. So sleepovers until really I got to college, never happened. And now when I go home, it's a bit more common. It's been a while since she was like, well, your brothers didn't sleep over anywhere, so you're not. Why would you sleep over someone else's house when you have a perfectly good bed? She didn't understand. And I would, it makes sense.
I remember that conversation going on.
Yeah. So I would just be like, why aren't you understanding? First I'd get mad at that. Then it kind of shifted to a little bit later, and this was actually a couple of years ago recently that I started changing my mind. But for a long time I was like, okay, I get that you don't understand, but why don't you just accept it? You may not understand it, but you're here, you're in the States, you have to adapt to your sort of lifestyle. You should just accept that this is what happens. If I can't explain it to you, that's too bad. You just have to accept it. This is what happens. And she would fight me on everything. And a lot more fighting when I went through that rebellious stage pretty early, from 9 until 13. And then I was okay. But yeah, so then it changed to, why aren't you just accepting it? Why aren't you just accepting the kind of life that you have here? And this is how the reality is now. And now, kind of like what was mentioned earlier, it's sort of defeated. My mom doesn't know I'm in a sorority, because I don't have the language skills, and nor does she have that idea of a sorority. She just doesn't know what it is. The rest of my family knows, and it's a pretty big part of my life here. So when I have to go buy things for it, she's like, oh, what are you gonna buy? I was just like, School supplies, like that's about as much as I can tell her. So now it's kind of just sort of exasperated, defeated. Like you don't understand, you're never going to understand. That's just the way it is, and that's how I'm gonna have to take it. There's a lot of distance between us now, I think.
And I think what's interesting here is that what you're touching on is something that is not unique about, you know, the adolescent experience, because everybody goes, you know, often, you know, the tension with parents, but there's something also very unique when you have, you know, an immigrant family that's part of that, you know, that stage in your life. You're going through, you know, hormones and identity crisis, but on top of that, there's also the, you know, the cultural differences that occurs. And, you know, what manifests also then often is that resentment towards parents. And one of the things, and you know, just kind of opening this up to everybody is, you know, in what ways does this mean that perhaps the way we think about the relationships between parents and children are very narrowly defined, right? So I resented my mom a lot because I didn't have, and my grandmother, right, because she was mostly the maternal figure in that, but I didn't have that kind of like female bond that I had seen or read about in books. And, you know, it took a lot of years and therapy to realize, well, wait a minute, my definition of what a mother-daughter or, you know, the daughter-granddaughter relationship was like was very white, very middle class, very suburban, very, you know, mid to late 20th century. And, like, it didn't happen until way later on, but it would have saved me a lot of grief if somebody had told me, like, actually, maybe the standard for what you think a parent-child relationship is actually not that universal, right? And I don't know if, you know, any of you have thought about that, or, you know, where do you see the kind of ethnocentrism that is all over the place in terms of parent-child relationships? I don't know. Ellie?
One thought I sort of had about that is, so my dad's from New Zealand. I grew up in the U.S. My mother grew up in Delaware as well. But I think having a father who, you know, looks white but has a funny accent, but is clearly sort of Westerner, it's really different. But he's also like the only New Zealander. You know, there's no other ones around, and I think people have great difficulty knowing what is like a trait of him because of his New Zealand culture, and what is a trait of him as an individual. And you maybe see that really differently if you're from Mexico and there's lots of Mexicans and you can kind of take averages in some way. What's a cultural phenomena and what's this person who likes this thing, right? So I think everyone in Delaware that knows my parents think that all New Zealanders like gardening. You know, that's not necessarily true. And I wonder if getting at this thing, it's really hard with identity to know, you know, what parts of this identity you're embracing and taking on. You know, in what ways was your mother this way because she was Filipino and I came from this culture?
Right.
And to what extent do you sort of say, you know, there's lots of American suburban white mothers who are also strict, or not affectionate, or not something else. And it's a really interesting tension of how much is you sort of excusing or explaining or whatever the resentment because of who they are versus this larger cultural phenomena they might be a part of. And so I guess I'm curious your thoughts on individuals versus the whole.
And that's where I'm at now. Like, I don't know, right? So, yeah.
For me, because of how my childhood was and all those struggles and that, right? Now that I have a daughter, it's very different, you know, because it shaped my thinking in how am I going to be with my child? Because as you get older, you do realize that, wow, that was really dumb. Is that how I really treated my mom or dad? You know, you just start to realize sort of those things. And so for me, with my daughter, my approach is sort of very different in the sense that I try to show her all there is to know about the Indian culture, but from the point of view that I know that she will be intrigued and you know, sort of fascinated by it and is sort of proud. And now she does, and you know, she wants to wear Indian clothes when we go out or try different cultural things. She likes to listen to Indian music now, you know, because she also sees that she has other Indian cousins that are her age, or, well, not her age, a little bit older, but they're into this, so, okay, mom thinks it's cool, but I don't, but, well, my cousins think it's cool, so I like it now, kind of thing, you know? So it's really, for me, it's really nice. I feel really blessed, to be honest with you, that I'm watching this young person not having to struggle the way I did. It feels so good knowing that she can actually, you know, she's in both. And I mean, she's, like I said, she's born and raised here, so this is very rural, and there are times when I'm sort of surprised because I'm like, wow, she's really Midwestern, that's not me whatsoever, you know? But I accept that that's part of where she's at too, so, yeah. It's just,
So, 36, is that? Yeah, I think, are there any sort of last questions? Yeah, last question.
I guess kind of, since there's like broad spectrum of like age and everything, when did you kind of figure out or like think about it in your own mind that you were no longer just any child, but you were a different type of child, and not just any